In this video, we're going to set the household codes in 1 Peter in their ancient context. So this is one of the things that gets the most attention in 1 Peter. And so we're going to be dealing with other household codes in the ancient world and be in an attempt to see how these household codes work in their ancient context, but in a sort of uniquely Christian ways, the ways that Jesus is going to affect the household code. So we're dealing with our course thesis with a particular text and a particular part of a text, namely the household codes in 1 Peter, but also the way that Jesus is going to sort of morph the way that household codes work in the early church. And so to get us started, what I want you to do is actually turn to the household codes and reread them. So these are going to appear in 1 Peter chapter 2 verses 11 through chapter 3 verses 12. And what I want you to do is read and reflect on this particular portion of 1 Peter and see sort of what comes to mind as you read it. Do you find this portion of text liberating? Does it read as oppressive to you? Do you think it's hard to accept as scripture? Is it easy to accept as scripture? And sort of different people are going to have different takes on this portion of scripture. So what I want you to do is go to that portion of scripture and really think about how you read it and how it reads to you before we put it into sort of its ancient literary context and before we get more information about the household codes, so that you can come back to what you say sort of at the beginning of it after you watch this video and after you do some more reading on household codes and see if and how your understanding of this chapter of 1 Peter changes over the course of the things that you engage for this week. All right, so now that you've done that, we're going to get a little bit more on household codes in the ancient world. So what a household code is really sort of an outline or a way to set out norms of behavior for keeping the peace, making sure things that life goes as planned, particularly in a household. And what we find is that they have both, this particular literary genre has both Greco-Roman and Jewish precedent, so that we see household codes reflected in ancient Greek and Roman texts, as well as in ancient Jewish texts that are not in the New Testament. So just a few examples of these. I am not going to read all of Aristotle's Politics here, but you see sort of an ancient precedent. That Aristotle is, of course, going to be much revered in the first century world and already have sort of the historical standing. And you can see here in the Politics the way that Aristotle lays out a household code and a sort of hierarchy of how things are supposed to function. So what I want you to do is go ahead and pause this and take a minute or so just to read this selection from Aristotle's Politics. So what I want you to notice in Aristotle's take here is the very hierarchical nature of the sort of the world and the household, that you have a very strong sense of one group is here, one group is here, and one group is here. And the lower you go down in that hierarchy, the less autonomy those groups have. So this is going to be sort of one of the foundations of Greco-Roman household codes, is a strong hierarchy with less moral autonomy as you go down, and really a focus on the top of the hierarchy as being most significant. So let's move on to and here I give you the bullet point. Adult free male has the authority and the moral autonomy. So they're at the top of that hierarchy and are really the focus of the household code for Aristotle. So an example from Philo, who is a rough contemporary of 1 Peter, also writing in the 1st century CE, is a Jew from Alexandria, Egypt. In a shorter text here, Philo says that wives must be in servitude to their husbands, a servitude not imposed by violent ill treatment, but promoting obedience in all things. Parents must have power over their children. The same holds for any other persons over whom the man has authority. So once again in Philo, we get this sense of a hierarchy, a husband at the top, wives in conjunction with their husband having then authority over children. But you do sort of get a nuance here that the servitude of the wife to a husband, according to Philo, is not one that is made by violent manner. That there's sort of this you might call it goodwill or good intent on that the husband should have, and it's for that reason, according to Philo, that the wife is under the husband. It's because of the good intent. And then also Josephus, a near contemporary of both the author of Peter and Philo, says, "The woman, says the law, is in all things inferior to the man. Let her accordingly be submissive, not for her humiliation, but that she may be directed, for the authority has been given by God to the man." So once again, we see a Jewish contemporary of the writer of 1 Peter having this sort of hierarchy of man, woman. So all of this to sort of put into context what the author of 1 Peter is doing, and to show that the author of 1 Peter is sort of not alone in this environment by doing this sort of thing. They're not sort of a lone ranger or a maverick within the culture at large, or even specifically within the Jewish culture, of this idea of the hierarchy of man, woman, children, slave, etc. So what we've seen then is that 1 Peter is not alone in having household codes. That it's participating in a known genre, and it's reflecting elements of that genre, specifically with who is addressed in the household codes. And what we find in these household codes, both in their Greco-Roman and Jewish precedents, but also to some extent in 1 Peter and in the New Testament, there's this sort of re-inscription of the authority of what is called the pater familias, the head of the household. So we have this top-down structure, as we've seen in these other household codes, that in some ways is repeated in the New Testament household codes that occur in these three different texts: Ephesians 5:21 through 6:9, Colossians 3:12 through 4:6, and then our text at hand, 1 Peter 2:11 through 3:12. So this is to say that there are also household codes in other places in the New Testament. That 1 Peter is not a lone ranger as to household codes more generally, but it's also not a lone ranger as to household codes in the New Testament itself. So what I want to do here is, and we're going to spend more time on this sort of on our own and as a course community, not just in this video, sort of dealing with the household codes and what to make of them. We have some additional materials on them as well. But I want to walk through what you might find to be potentially difficult about the household codes, and how we might also think of those as in a different light, maybe put a little bit of a different spin on them. And this isn't going to be a comprehensive way of doing this. I'm not going to sort of address it in full. We're going to do more of that as we move forward for the week, but just to call attention to some of these things. So some of the things that might be hard for you, or if you're anything like me, that sort of the way in which the text might initially rub you in the wrong way, is this claim for the audience of 1 Peter to be subject to every authority. So the contrarian in me always says, if someone tells me to listen to an authority figure, I automatically don't want to do that. And then this sort of gets applied with respect to specific groups within the audience of 1 Peter, namely commanding slaves to accept the authority of their masters, and commanding wives to accept the authority of their husband. This phrase in 3:7, that the woman is the weaker sex, according to 1 Peter. And we saw this sort of repeated also in the other household codes, the Greco-Roman and the Jewish household codes. But what might we do with these, and what might we find sort of that is maybe a little bit more liberating, and what kind of Christian spins might 1 Peter be putting on some of the difficulties in the household codes? So what I want to do is sort of call attention to some of these. Here we have this statement in 1 Peter 2:12, to conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that though they malign you as evildoers, there's a purpose to this. First, the author of 1 Peter says, they may see your honorable deeds and glorify God when he comes to judge. So the author of 1 Peter is sort of giving a reason why you act in a certain way, and namely so that God might be glorified in your actions. And then 1 Peter 3, 8 through 9 says, finally, all of you have unity of spirit, sympathy, love for one another, a tender heart, a humble mind. Don't repay anyone evil for evil or abuse for abuse, but on the contrary, repay with a blessing. It is for this that you were called, so that you might inherit a blessing. So again, there's this sort of purpose, or there's a telos, or an end to acting in a certain way. And this idea of repaying someone who harms you with a blessing, we see this sort of theme of acting, not repaying evil for evil, repaying evil with blessing, repeated in a number of contexts, not only in the New Testament, but also sort of in literature generally. And it's really sort of a celebrated concept and a celebrated theme that when we see someone blessing someone who has harmed them, we really celebrate that as sort of a human virtue. Then this bit about be subject to every authority, which may be troublesome to you in some way. Again, the reason for this, 1 Peter doesn't say be subject to every authority just for the sake of being subject to every authority, but by doing right, you should silence the ignorance of the foolish. That there's sort of a reason by which you act in a certain way, a reason by which you accept authority, and that is to silence the ignorance of the foolish, to sort of show someone or show the wider society that that things aren't exactly as they seem. If the idea is that Christians are troublemakers for not worshiping the emperor, not worshiping the polytheistic gods, by being subject to authority, this allows Christians sort of in that setting, it gives them space to show the ways that Christianity sort of works in the culture and can be a blessing to the culture. Then this bit about slaves accepting the authority of your master. What's unique here is that, so 1 Peter says, for it is a credit to you if being aware of God, you endure pain while suffering unjustly. You have God's approval, and that Christ also suffered for you, leaving you an example so that you should follow in his steps. What 1 Peter does here really uniquely amongst the household codes is give slaves autonomy by saying, if you act this certain way, you're actually doing something, you're accomplishing something. This is pretty unique to the household codes, where it's normally this very much sort of top-down structure, wherein a master is instructed to act towards a slave in a certain way. Whereas 1 Peter sort of flips this around and says now the slave has autonomy to act in a certain way and produce results because of that action. And we get a similar sort of thing going on with the claim for the command for wives to accept the authority of their husband. That there's this sense in which that by acting in a certain way, that the wife's conduct, the woman's conduct sort of accomplishes something. And remember, we think back to the household code in Philo, the instruction was the wives should be submissive to their husband because the husband acts in a sort of loving way. Again, 1 Peter flips this around and works from sort of the bottom of the authority structure in a household code upwards, giving the women authority. And then we have this bit at the end of becoming like Sarah, becoming Sarah's daughters, remembering that 1 Peter is written to a largely Gentile audience who wouldn't necessarily see Sarah, the biblical figure Sarah, Abraham's wife, as their ancestor, as one who they claim their descent from, but by acting in a certain way, they become part. They are entered into that lineal line, the family line of Sarah, by their actions. And then lastly, the woman is the weaker sex here in 1 Peter 3:7. So what's interesting about 1 Peter 3:7, as difficult as it is and as problematic as it is to make the claim that the woman is the weaker sex, and however much we sort of want to reject that claim, the author goes on to say that since they too are also heirs of the gracious gift of life. So the perspective isn't just, the men get the good stuff. The men are heirs of Israel's line. The men get to be included in the worship of the Jewish God and are given new life. But also women. There's sort of a flattening of identity in a way where both are heirs, both men and women are heirs. And so that there is more of an equal playing field in this follow-up statement to the more difficult one of the woman as the weaker sex. So if we're to sort of take together what we've talked about with the what might be the difficult parts of the household code in 1 Peter, and then taking together some of those other elements that when we turn it around a little bit might be a little bit more liberating given the cultural and historical context of 1 Peter. I want to sort of lay out some of the principles that seem to be presented in 1 Peter based on its cultural and historical context. So remember, we're thinking of 1 Peter in a setting of not official persecution, but suffering and persecution on the basis of Christians not worshiping the emperor, not worshiping the polytheistic gods, and sometimes in some settings being seen as a threat to the peace of the Roman Empire and the peace of particular geographical locations. One of the things that the household codes in 1 Peter seem to be doing is sort of instructing Christians in a way to so that they can show that Christianity is not a threat to societal peace, even though they do not worship the emperor and the polytheistic gods. That early Christians can sort of get along in society and really be a blessing to society, even though they won't cross the line into idolatry. The other principle that I sort of pull out of the household code in 1 Peter is that patriarchy and hierarchy are not uncritically prescribed in this top-down model that we see in other household codes. That that there's this sort of flipping of the household codes, and autonomy is given to those who are traditionally lower down in the other Greco-Roman and Jewish household codes. And this flipping of the perspective in some ways gives those who are not normally given autonomy in the household codes, autonomy in the Christian household code in 1 Peter. And then, so this is what we're saying here, what I sort of just explained. Slaves, wives, and husbands all have moral autonomy. It's not just husbands that are commanded, and it's not, the order of the command doesn't go from the top to the bottom. It starts with the slaves and goes up toward wives and up towards husbands, so that there's this total sort of flip of the household code in 1 Peter. And lastly, what we find in the household code in 1 Peter is that moral autonomy has a purpose. It has an end or a telos. It's meant to demonstrate Christian conduct and glorify God in a particular cultural and historical context. So one of the mistakes of 1 Peter, or one of the mistakes in how we might apply the household code in 1 Peter is to say, well, the household code is, it's authoritative scripture, and as such, it should be applied in the same way in any given cultural context. Instead, we need to recognize that it's working in a particular cultural and historical context and see the ways that it is particularly working, the specific things it does in that context, and then think more about the sort of general tone or the general telos or the general end of the household codes, what its purpose is, why the commands are in there, why slaves and wives and husbands should act the way they do. And then when we move to other cultural contexts, we don't sort of uncritically apply the household code in the same way in each context, but those principles of sort of working from the bottom up can work differently in the 21st century than they do in the 1st century.